Hello, welcome to BC Referendum 2018. Are you voting for change? My name is Laurel Collins, and I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Michael Prince, and our guest today, Mike Morris, the MLA from Prince George Mackenzie. Mike, can you tell us a little bit about your position and the BC Liberal position on the upcoming referendum?
Well, the BC Liberal position, we'll see what each individual member has to say on their own. Basically, I think most of them oppose PR for a number of reasons. My position is I take a different tact than many of my colleagues on this. I look at it more from a constitutional perspective. And in my estimation, I've read a little bit about this over the last 8 or 10 months or so. But in my estimation, I don't think proportional representation meets the standard that we have in Canada under our Constitution. The Constitution is a strong document that binds Canada together. And between it and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it has some pretty significant rules in place as to what we can and can't do in Canada. So it's my estimation that PR does not meet that constitutional threshold.
Can you outline for our viewers just how it doesn't meet that threshold?
Well, Section 3 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms basically says, and I'll be paraphrasing here because I can't remember word for word, basically says that every citizen has the right to vote for a member of the legislature or House of Commons, depending on federal or provincial. The PR models that I've examined, and there's a good reference website out there for people to have a look at themselves. It's called aceprojects.org. And I've read that a lot, and I've looked at a lot of the models around the world. Every proportional representation model that I've seen have open or closed lists. They're multi-member ridings, number one, we have to keep that in mind, but they have open and closed lists. So a closed list is where the party will pick who sits in the legislature. An open list is where you vote for the party, and you may vote for some representatives on the list, but the party chooses the list. So it doesn't go through that rigorous process where candidates are picked locally by their riding associations or by their party or whatever, and they run against other members in the riding to see who's going to represent them. So there's a process in place that makes sure that we have people that the grassroots people within the communities want. And a PR system won't allow that. It's just the way it's constructed, and I haven't seen one yet that affords that ability.
Now, the voters are going to have two questions on the ballot. One, a general question around whether they want to switch to proportional representation, and the second one outlining 3 models. So the 3 models that are presented, you've done the research, none of them?
None of those 3 models will meet the constitutional challenge, I'm sure. And but you also brought up the referendum, and I don't think the referendum itself, the process, is constitutional. And of course, there's a court case that will be going before the courts on that now, initiated by the Independent Contractors Business Association. So we'll see how that progresses. From my reading on that issue, and I looked at that way back in January, that was the first thing that jumped out at me, is that it won't meet that constitutional test.
And I guess part of that, I read the submission, Mike, and I guess part of that is the concern that 5 months is just too short a time for the campaign to allow people an adequate amount of opportunities for reflection, information that compared to, and also not enough money really to allow groups to mobilize an adequate for or against campaign. So in terms of the Constitution, freedom of expression, freedom of association, I guess, is some of the arguments that when we hear there's constitutional concerns, it's partly around some of those sections in the Charter. Is that right?
Yeah, that's part of it.
Yeah.
I think a more significant part of it, though, is our Constitution. When it comes to electoral reform in Canada, our Constitution says that we need 60% of the provinces and 50% of the population in order to pass electoral reform in Canada. And the federal Constitution is paramount. It affects all legislations and jurisdictions across Canada. So what we have here is a very low threshold. We have no regional thresholds in place in British Columbia, and we have 50% of eligible votes cast, which again does not meet that constitutional challenge. It has to be 50% of eligible voters instead of eligible votes cast. So to me, that's fundamentally wrong. Right. And I think when the courts have a look at that, they'll probably grant the injunction and say, Mr. Attorney General, you got to go back to the drawing board on this and make sure that these thresholds are in place. And those thresholds have been in place for, right since Confederation. It was tested back in 1989. There was a BC Court of Appeal case that came out. There was an individual that said we don't need electoral boundaries in BC. Everybody votes, and whatever the outcome is, the outcome is. And that was looked at in depth, and it was one of the first challenges under Section 3 of the Charter Rights and Freedoms. The court case started back in about 1985. It was heard in 1989, and it's been one of the foundational cases that the Supreme Court has looked at and used in every decision since throughout the 90s and 2000s regarding electoral change and different things. And at that particular time, and it was the Chief Judge of the BC Court of Appeal at that time was Beverly McLaughlin, who went on to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada. She researched it significantly, and she said, one of the fundamental things that Section 3 provides every single Canadian is not only the right to vote for a member of the legislature, but it also means that every member, every citizen of British Columbia and Canada will have equal access, will have an equal vote.
Right.
And in order to do that, we need electoral boundaries. So she instructed British Columbia at the time to institute an Electoral Boundaries Commission that goes out and examines the province and ensures that every area, every electoral district in the province is equally based on population, plus or minus 25%.
Right.
But also taking into consideration regional and geographical differences.
Right.
And that's the difference between Canada and the U.S. When it comes to one person, one vote.
Absolutely.
So that provides equalization to the votes.
Right.
So if you don't have that regional representation in British Columbia, then you don't have an equal vote, because at any given time, when you look at the population disparities that we have in BC, the Capital Regional District here in Victoria has more people than the northern 80% of the province.
Right. Right.
So the Capital Regional District in BC could outvote the northern 80% any day of the week. And then you combine that with Vancouver. So the GVRD and the Capital Regional District has 62% of the population on 0.53% of the land base.
Right.
So that's why that was in there. And that's why the Constitution looked at that. And right back to Sir John A. Macdonald, he said, we need to take into consideration, because Canada is such a vast and varied country, we need to take into consideration the geographical and regional differences. Right. So right back to the days of Confederation, and that has stood strong and fast in all the court decisions ever since. So this referendum process doesn't take that into consideration. So that's one of the fundamental flaws of that process.
But in terms of the Attorney General's report, and I believe the admittedly sketched outlines of the three options of the PR models, there's a principle that rural areas will not be diminished in any sense in terms of the existing number of seats will remain. So there seems to be some recognition of the issue you just raised, of trying to reassure people in the northern or outside of the Metro Vancouver and lower South Vancouver Island that the rural and northern areas will not be reduced in any way in terms of representation. Is that a partial acknowledgement, you think, or recognition of the issue you just raised?
Well, it is, but it is false, I guess. So the electoral boundaries as they were proposed in 2009 for that referendum is one example we can look at where the size of the ridings increased significantly.
Right.
But you're talking about one of the other fundamental problems with the referendum process itself, and I can talk about the PR side, but I'll talk about the process itself. So as soon as you take away the regional differences, you no longer have the equality of voting in place. And so that really needs to be looked at by the attorney if he's going to make any changes to this. The other part of that is the Supreme Court of Canada, and as recently as in the 2000s, looked at a couple of different cases dealing with referendums. And the court said that the general voting principles and guidelines that apply to a general election should also apply to a referendum. So if we go back to the 2009 referendum that was held here in British Columbia, it was presented by the BC Liberals at that time that we'll hold the referendum in conjunction with the municipal election in 2009.
Right.
Chief Electoral Officer looked at it and says, no, you can't do that. Under the Elections Act, if a general election coincides during the same campaign period as a municipal election, you have to change it, because the voting requirements for the voters are different for a general election provincially and municipally. So why is that not happening now? We've got this extended campaign period. It's overlapping, the referendum is overlapping with the municipal elections. So the Chief Electoral Officer actually has the authority to postpone the referendum so that it doesn't coincide with a municipal election. So and that hasn't taken place. And
any sense of when this court decision may be heard, or this is a rather dramatic? This could really hit the pause button and stop the whole game. So.
Well, it could, and that's why they're asking for the injunction.
Right.
The ICBA is asking for an injunction to stop the process until such time as the whole court proceedings have concluded, and that could take years if it goes to the Supreme Court of Canada. Yeah. But even if it doesn't stop, and at the end of the day, the process indicates that it was wrong, then we'd have to go right back to today in order to rectify it. And of course, I think it was a justice of the BC Supreme Court that talked about the poison fruit of the constitutional tree. So, you know, the constitutional tree is grounded in the federal constitution, but any fruit that comes out of it that doesn't match the constitution is poison fruit, and we have to cut the tree down, I guess.
Or some pruning anyways.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to wait to see what happens with this court challenge. But in the meantime, you're going to be campaigning for the no side. What are some of the kind of core values or the benefits you see from our current first past the post system?
Well, you know, the first past the post system isn't perfect, but there's no system that does meet everybody's needs. You know, so I'm still going to be pushing the constitutional side of things. When we look at the equality of voting and all the work that Beverly McLaughlin went through to research and come out with a decision on making equality of voting fundamental as one of the core values of Section 3 of the Charter. So we have the Boundaries Commission going out and establishing these equal electoral districts, and then you have a vote. And then you apply a mathematical formula, the Droop formula, to say, well, the popular vote was taken. You know, the Capital Regional District had 20% of the people wanted green. 4 or 5 ridings in Vancouver wanted green. The rest of the province voted in favor of first past the post, or whatever the case might be. But when you bring that equality of voting into play, the Droop formula destroys that. So it's a mathematical formula that establishes the first tier of representatives in the legislature, and then you go to another very complex mathematical formula that determines how much weight is applied to all the rest of the candidates voting to see where they will sit in the process. The courts, again, and a couple of cases that I can think of on top of my head, have come out and said, as soon as you apply a mathematical formula, equality of voting goes out the window. So again, it's a fundamental flaw that doesn't meet the Charter test if we go in that direction. So people want, up in rural BC, but it's no different in Vancouver or Victoria, in particular in Victoria, when you see the municipalities that we have and the ownership that people take within their communities. And if all of a sudden you say, everybody, you're going to be included in this one big area here, the people in Cordova Bay versus Central Saanich versus Esquimalt are going to say, well, we're not the same as those guys. How come you're mixing us in with them? And the same thing applies up north. Well, we're quite a bit different in the Kitimat-Skeena region than we are in Northwest BC or Northeast BC. Very different issues, and that's where we go back to the days of Confederation when Sir John A. Macdonald said that we have to take those into consideration.
Now, a couple of those options on the ballot wouldn't change some of those northern ridings at all. Some of them will be left just as is for dual member proportional. The northern larger ridings would actually remain as single member ridings. Does that alleviate any of your concerns?
No, because it changes the equality of voting. So you've got single member ridings with the same electoral districts where we vote based upon population and regional and geographical differences. And then you get a lower mainland or a more urbanized electoral area that might have 7 members running in that particular area in a large geographical area that could have a different regional outlook on things, and that population base alone would outvote any other area of British Columbia.
Now that would be for the rural-urban option. For dual member, it would just be combining 2 ridings into one. You'd have 2 members in a greater Vancouver or, in the Capital Regional District.
Yeah.
I'm curious, you talked a little bit about the critiques of proportional representation. Some of the critiques of first past the post is that it is also unfair, that critics say that one party will get 40% of the vote, they get over 50% of the seats, and then they have 100% of the power. How do you respond to those?
So that's reflective of the regional and geographical differences that we have in Canada and the provinces. One of the big differences between Canada and BC versus Germany and New Zealand and Ireland and some of these other countries that have PR is population densities. Germany is 230 people per square kilometer, or some figure like that. New Zealand is up close to 100. Ireland is up close to 100. Canada is 4.5 people per square kilometer, and BC is about the same, 4.5 people per square kilometer in BC, although most of them live within 20 miles of the border, kind of a thing in BC here. So that would be a fundamental difference that we have here. And when you look at even making dual member ridings, and BC had dual member ridings for a while back in the 90s, 80s and 90s there. But when you have dual member ridings, you're looking at large geographic areas. We already have large geographic areas. Shirley Bond's riding in Valemont is the size of Belgium right now, and mine's not much different. Yeah. And if we were to combine those two into one riding, it would be a significant area. So Valemont and Mackenzie wouldn't stand a chance of running a candidate because all the power base would be in the 100,000 people that we have in Prince George.
Now, the Attorney General report did say that the larger northern ridings would just stay as single member. It would be the smaller rural or urban and semi-urban ridings that would be combined into 2.
Right, so you destroy voter equality right there. As soon as you go to 2 different systems, you evaluate things differently, and so voter equality goes out the window, and that's one of the fundamental parts of Section 3 of the Charter. Yeah.
Now, one of the arguments or knocks against first past the post, Mike, as you've well heard. Well, take your riding, for example. You've won very successfully in 2 elections, 55, 57% of the vote, very strong. But for the other 45% or 43% who you weren't their choice, one of the critiques is over time, in particularly safe ridings, that are there safe NDP or safe Liberal seats, that people who maybe not be inclined to vote that way get discouraged. What's the point? Mike's going to get back in next time. The argument that might lead to voter apathy, lower turnout, and just disenchantment. And so the idea of how do we give some sense of equality or parity to those voters who just feel that the vote's wasted. So proportionality is trying to get at that somehow. So is there any way of improving on the first past the post system to address those kinds of concerns?
Probably number one is it's a misunderstanding that their votes are wasted and they're not represented. And again, I go back to Supreme Court of Canada and some of the comments they've made on it. One of the Supreme Court cases said that there's this misconception out there that people vote, and because the individual they voted for, the party they voted for, didn't get into power, that the vote's wasted. The court said there's no such thing as a wasted vote. Under the
it's
Charter.
Easy for a judge to say that.
Well, yeah, under the Charter, and this is where they're coming from. Under the Charter, Section 3 of the Charter, they say that everybody has a right to vote in BC and Canada. They have a right to meaningful representation, but that meaningful and effective representation is in the electoral process itself.
Right.
So everybody has a chance to run. You stand up and you sell your policy, you sell your position and your platform to the masses. And everybody votes on what they hear from all the candidates.
Right.
And at the end of the day, the candidates that get voted are the ones that have received the most votes in those individual particular ridings. So everybody's participated in the process. No votes were wasted. Everybody's vote counts. So that was part of it. The other part of it, the courts came out in a different case and they said that an elected official has two roles. One is the role of a legislator. So you're in the legislature and you represent everybody's interests and you debate the legislation and whatnot. But the other one, which is very important, is the role of an ombudsperson. Mm-hmm. So I represent everybody in my riding. Doesn't matter what political stripe they are, whatever their beliefs are, they can come in and talk to me anytime and present their issues, and I have to ensure that I take those concerns forward when we're debating in the legislature. Right. So I think our system is very well modeled to make British Columbia and Canada the best country in the world, which we are today.
Mm-hmm. It's a pretty high claim for an electoral system rather than an economy and other factors. One of the things I've observed is I think both sides either over-exaggerate the dangers or the benefits of the electoral system. It's embedded in, and I appreciate your comments. I think sometimes people have mistaken that a constituency office isn't just for people who happen to vote Liberal, but it's open to all constituents. And I think that's an important message for us to relay on this show.
It's nonpartisan.
Yeah, it's nonpartisan, and that's a really strong quality of our system. So I'm just, with respect to the judges, I think a lot of people just feel that their own preferences, their own values, they don't feel that they might respect you, and even if they didn't vote for you, but in a sense of their own preferences and they don't see a presence in the legislature of what they would like to have seen. And if they live in that area and live that community, for most of their adult life, they may never see a representative that truly reflects that. That's part of what I think, without abandoning the plurality system of first past the post, it's trying to add some dimension of proportionality that allows a greater sense of voice being represented. I'm just, what I hope to hear in this campaign is not the stark either ors, but seeing if there's some middle ground around electoral reform that tries to address clearly the sense of apathy that we've been seeing and disengagement, certainly among younger British Columbians, which concerns me, is that there's a fair vote there. Enough of my speech, sorry. Laurel.
So just following up on this, the younger voters, it seems like there's been critiques of the No campaign, that it's a wealthy few, it's made up of lobbyists, they're running, full-page, front-page ads in the newspaper, whereas the appearance is that there's a more grassroots, a younger campaign from the yes side. Do you think that the No side is going to have the kind of energy and passion and younger demographic that we're seeing?
In my neck of the woods, yes. But again, I've been coming at this from a different perspective. Any kind of a system in my mind that improves our governance in Canada or British Columbia, let's go for it. But as long as it meets the constitutional glue that binds this country together. And so let me give another example of proportionality and some of the problems that we might have. If we go back to the 2009 referendum, it was basically 60-40. So 60% voted in favor of first past the post, 40% wanted change. So when we look at the numbers and we diagnose everything, or dissect everything, that 40% came from the capital regional of BC, Victoria here, Greater Victoria, and 4 ridings in Vancouver. That 40% of the vote came from there. So that's your regional people on 0.53% or less, actually, when you look at where the ridings were, of the population of British Columbia. So everybody down in the capital regional district of BC feels that the rest of the province should be doing and thinking and seeing things the same way they do. And they feel misrepresented in the House because of that.
Well, contrast that, Mike, though, with the previous referendum.
For 2000, I'm talking about 2009.
Yeah, pick the previous one, completely opposite.
So the previous one just about passed, and
support in all regions.
Yeah.
So it wasn't hinterland versus metro van or urban. That was a different campaign. So in a way, this is a third and different one as well.
So I'd like to suggest, though, that the one from 2005, the reason that had such high numbers, and people came back and they said, we need another referendum because we just about made it. And I don't think people understood it enough. So Elections BC went and produced maps showing what a proposed PR system would look like in BC. And people saw that and they thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to lose my representation in the area here. Our ridings are going to be so big and they're going to have multiple members. Who am I going to go to and whatnot? So I think once people understood exactly what would happen with that representation, that showed the vote in 2009, where the 60-40.
Okay, great.
Should the constitutional challenge not stop the referendum, what are your plans for the campaign? What are you going to be doing in the months leading up to the referendum and during the referendum period?
I'm still going to stand on my stool and talk about the constitutionality of it, yeah, because that's, like I said, that's the glue that binds our country together. And so if there was a PR system that met the Constitution, then let's have a look at it. But don't come out with these models where nobody has really explored how it fits into that. And I don't think I've done a lot of reading on PR in Canada, right across the country, and I have never seen one reference to the Constitution and the Charter. It's all been what people think and what people believe would be a better system, but they've never grounded it in what the Constitution says.
I have a hunch you'll be invited by a lot of your colleagues to, because you seem to be the specialist, certainly within the Liberal caucus, on this particular dimension of it, Mike.
Well, it's an interest of mine.
Yeah,
you know,
right.
I spent all my time in the RCMP,
Right.
and case law was something that I always had to be referencing all the time to make sure we did our job right. So everything that we do, I always check the authorities, the legislation or the Constitution or whatever it is, to make sure that we're standing on solid ground.
Sure.
Yeah.
Understandable. Yeah. I guess just one last would give you an opportunity to, besides the constitutional side, we're going to hear a lot about the PR and these three options, which, as you've pointed out, we haven't got maps yet, we haven't got a lot of the details, but in the time remaining, first past the post. I mean, it's a system you've been part of. Just in a nutshell, what are besides the constitutional, what else do you see as a benefit to your constituents, to British Columbians in general? So
accountability. You know, accountability. If you had multi-member ridings like we had, and I've talked to members that were MLAs during that period of time, and it very quickly turns into one of these. You know, like, who's responsible for this falling off the table? Well, it wasn't I had no idea. I wasn't involved in that. It must have been you. So accountability is a big factor. So when you have single member ridings and one MLA who shoulders the responsibility, I'm accountable. If something falls off the rails and I don't do something in my riding, then blame me. Boot me out next time and vote somebody in that will do it. With a PR system, you don't have that. With a PR system and a party deciding who is going to represent an area through the closed list system or even an open list system, problematic for me that I don't have an opportunity to pick who is going to represent me.
Okay. Laura?
Thank you so much. I think that's all the time we have.
Yeah, thank you, Mike Morris, for coming in, MLA from Prince George, Mackenzie, and thank my co-host Laurel, and thank you for watching our latest episode of BC Referendum 2018. Are you voting for change? Thank you for watching.
Good evening. My name is Jake Harrigan. I'm joined here by my co-host Fernando Garci-Crespo. Welcome to another segment of Voting for Change.
Here today we have Ian Soutar. Ian is a small business owner, an activist, and a previous candidate in Coquitlam for the provincial election for the Greens. And we're very excited to have him here and to hear what his views are on proportional representation in this upcoming referendum.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the show, Ian.
Yeah.
So how did you first hear about proportional representation? What was your first exposure with it?
Probably about as soon as I got into politics, because that was about 2015, right before the federal elections.
Right.
And I want to save some trees by fighting Stephen Harper. What's the only way that makes sense? With the Green
Right.
Party, they're never going to get in. Why is that? Oh, because of our electoral system. So that's where I started to learn about, we start with first past the post, you see what's wrong with that, and then, well, what are the other options? Oh, proportional representation, like almost every other developed country in the world. So
Right, definitely. So for you, it wasn't even looking at these options as something on the bright horizon. It was just what was wrong with our current system.
Yes.
And that's what started you on this little journey.
Yeah, I mean, the Prime Minister did a fabulous job of getting it on everyone's minds and making them vote Liberal, and then we learned about it after the committee went across the entire country and got everyone excited. So we learned a lot about it in, I guess, in the last couple of years as well.
So what is wrong with first past the post? Like you said you first learned about what was wrong with our system.
There's a lot of really complex details that a person could go down, but simply put, there are more people not getting what they want than people getting what they want out of their government, which doesn't make any sense. You have a minority of the people making the majority of the decisions, which is not representative of the country. So if it's not proportional or representative, then it's the opposite, which is not good for democracy.
No, exactly. It seems to go against a lot of what we imagine to be the basic democratic values that we all hold dear.
Well, it makes sense if there are only two political parties in the system, or binary thinking. Yes, winner, loser, makes a lot of sense. But we're diverse people in this country with more than two ways of thinking. So as soon as we have that, the system breaks down.
Yeah, definitely. So you've got multiple candidates, multiple viewpoints that don't get expressed properly when you're trying to funnel them through this one mechanism, first past the post, which is our current system.
Yes, exactly. I think about not the last provincial elections, but the one before that. In Adam Olson's riding, he lost by a handful of votes. The next runner-up lost by a handful of votes, which means there were about 3 different directions that the system could have gone, and that means 2/3 of people didn't get what they wanted, which is really upsetting.
Right, you think in a system that should be represented in some way, but in our current system, no?
Not at all.
No.
Not at all.
No. So you're trying to actively change that. What has your journey looked like?
Well, I started getting engaged in the committee process when the Electoral Reform Committee was going across Canada. So fill out the surveys, which actually seemed to be pretty okay the first time around. Go and visit the town hall when the committee came to Vancouver. And that was pretty resounding in favor of PR. And then of course, then the Liberals didn't like the answers that they got, so they put out another survey that was really watered down, but I still tried to participate in that. And that was, even still, those numbers largely indicated that, yes, we want to move to a more representative system, and they blatantly disregarded that. So then we're just, enraged about just politicians being status quo politicians and just saying something, doing the opposite. So that really, when we got the opportunity to have a new government here in BC, really pushed for that by running with the Green Party, because couldn't vote for the status quo parties. The binary system is not really what I like to participate in. And then we got our new government, and they said we're going to have a referendum. So now we're doubling down.
Right. So here we are.
Yeah.
And what are you actively involved in terms of groups, proponent side?
So obviously I'm really involved with the Green Party. I'm co-chair of the Young Greens of Canada, but I think this is a nonpartisan issue. So we're really stepping back from waving a particular color over top of it. So I've started working with a subsidiary of the Yes Coalition, BC Youth for PR. So that's young people trying to change the system.
We actually had Fraser, our last episode was with Fraser.
Yes, that kid is mad inspirational. So
yeah.
he called me up and I said, yes, obviously I'm going to be involved in that. And we're helping round up young people across the country, and or at least, across the province. And certainly I've seen on campus at SFU and UBC and even University of the Fraser Valley that people don't even notice the Green Party banner. They just see proportional representation and sort of come forward like zombies.
Well, it's interesting though, because it's different. You talk about moving backwards from a partisan issue. Why is that? Because this is where we talk about electing representatives. Those representatives usually have parties. Why is it that you're talking about backing away from the parties when you're talking to people about PR?
This is the system we're all functioning in. I mean, the more conservative side might argue that this is not good for stability, but I would argue the opposite, that if you have people voting the way that they want to vote rather than voting against someone that they don't want, you're going to have a more stable base rather than people swinging to the left, swinging to the right. You're going to have more stability with the larger numbers, unless someone makes a crazy statement or something, or their policies shift wildly and people are upset about it. people are largely going to stay the way that they want to be, at least.
Absolutely. We hear about that a lot of the time too, is the stabilizing effect that a lot of countries note when they move to a PR system, because a lot of the time people move towards the center. They're less pushed towards the sides, the extremes.
Yes.
But everyone is represented. So you go to places like Germany and you get these coalitions that you know that generally there's some kind of reassurance that if a policy that is popular gets passed, it won't get undone by the next government, because the parties in the middle who kind of become kingmakers will not go against the popular will.
Well, that's certainly the case as well. When you have those wild swings left and right, and government doesn't actually direct public servants, or sorry, individual parties don't direct public servants, it's government in general. These poor people just trying to do their job end up getting total different policy shifts, and then other people are lost through the cracks in that system, which is just so hard to stay motivated.
It is.
It's difficult, but we're moving forward, and there's a lot of discussion happening, which you must be excited to hear.
Yeah, no, the threshold's been set nice and low, and people already have a lot of experience with this. We're frustrated with the federal government for giving up on that promise, and certainly seeing that in other jurisdictions, Ontario, United States. We'll try not to go down that road, but people are really frustrated by that, and this is a really clear beacon in the more positive direction.
So as a Green, we often hear the Greens being the party that is more ardently supporting this issue. What is your experience within the party? Do you hear people wanting it because of self-benefit, or what is the things that you're hearing?
That's another fabulous reason to sort of take a step back from a partisan side, because obviously Greens would do better under a proportional system, because one of the most common things we hear at the door is, oh, I would totally vote for you, but you're not going to win. And which means people are not voting for what they want, they're voting against something that they don't want.
Right,
so
voting strategically, trying to make sure that their vote matters, which seems like it's a struggle in the current system.
Oh yeah, oh certainly. I mean, I know I had to run as a candidate provincially because I needed someone to vote for, because the other two parties I did not have any love for them at all, and certainly not, well, I mean, one of the candidates was nice, but our viewpoints were further away. So that's, I think, also under certain proportional systems, you could get to vote for both the party you want and the representative that you like in your region, because they might not necessarily be the same person. But definitely within the party, everyone's on board, and we've also, I think, largely, as a whole, we've tried to step back away from this as a partisan issue. So it's actually been kind of quiet for the Greens in BC, because we're under different banners.
Exactly, which is good to see, because I think one of the things that people need to focus on with this issue is that it's not primarily about the parties, it's about moving power back to the people, back to the base.
Yes, I know our current premier certainly has said those words many, many, many times, but definitely across all places where I've canvassed since the word of the referendum has come out, and bump into people in the NDP, and suddenly we've gone from the provincial elections where I don't say we were at each other's throats, but certainly there was some animosity there.
Tension.
Now we have a lot in common. We say, I mean, yes, we have things that we don't share in common, but let's not talk about that right now, because we have this glorious referendum happening, and then from that come other things that, oh, you also like environmental protection or other things like that, or social progressive policies. So
right, there's a little bit more collaboration across the lines.
Oh yeah,
It pulls people together towards a center.
Definitely.
So you talked about the Greens and the NDP, but what about outside of that? I mean, there are a lot of liberal or conservative voters federally and other ridings too.
Yes.
What is your take on how they feel about it?
So I certainly heard after the federal elections, when it came out that our Prime Minister was going back on his promise, that even though the Conservatives were not necessarily in favor of the system, they did agree that a politician should, keep their promises, especially if they said them over 2,000 times. But largely what I hear from, certainly from my own MLA, as much as I love her, I disagree that this would give rise to hate groups, or suddenly these radical fringe organizations. Greens have actually been fringe for a really long time. So
yeah, what's the definition of a fringe
exactly.
group?
But this is the language that comes out. We have these fringe groups that are more radical coming out and taking seat in the legislature. But I personally would rather see them in a more professional zone rather than right now, which is under the covers in the dark, causing trouble and making all sorts of issues where we can't even reason with them because they're very well hidden from the rest of society. Or, I mean, they've been largely blocked out of it. So the only other argument I hear is that it's too complicated. We need to stick with the simple system. But honestly, I just learned about dual member proportional this morning. It took 5 minutes on YouTube. So
there's some great videos out there that people can use to get educated if they want to.
It's certainly condescending to British Columbians and Canadians overall, saying you couldn't possibly understand this
exactly.
system.
But what about New Zealand? New Zealand did it. There's tons of other countries that in the last 2 decades have moved towards a PR system. Are we saying that we're not as smart as these people? I think that's insulting.
And Canada is one of the countries with the highest percentage of people with university degrees and education. And BC is, out of Canada, the most educated province. So
we don't need to be overly boastful about how intelligent we are, but we're certainly on par with the rest of the developed world.
Like, I have talked to middle-class students about it and even lower, and they understand the basic gist of it, and it's
because they've taken the time to go and explore the options. So I think what we really want to tell people, what we want to impart to them is, don't be put off because it's always being said that these are too complicated. Take the time, go investigate them for yourselves, and then come to a conclusion on your own.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of good resources, like you said, where you can go out and you can take this information in and process it.
I mean, I certainly need the help of an animation to understand how votes are allocated under single transferable vote. But when you see the animation, you go, oh, that makes perfect sense. And then, I mean, when we think about it, really, it turns out that a lot of Canadians don't actually understand first past the post, or they think that we already have a proportional system. So if we really want to be attacking education, let's start with where we're at right now.
With where we're at.
And you hear that a lot when we were street canvassing in the car-free day. You know, I was talking to people and saying, you know, the same thing that elected the person to the south is the same system that we use, and people are like signing against it. And the moment you don't frame it with, you know, like first past the post and things like that, but you just frame it, it's a system that doesn't work, it's the same system that is causing a lot of trouble, people really change that idea of the words that they don't understand. And you were talking about fringe parties and how you don't think it's so big of an issue, and do you think the 5% threshold was a good idea then?
I mean, I would have to, I guess we'll find out, really. So it sounds reasonable. Federally, the Greens certainly poll on an average of 4 to 6%, so that is kind of around the area we think. We've been mobilizing for several decades now as an official organization, so I can't really imagine, say, anti-immigrant organizations popping up in the next year or so and having such a rally behind them.
Not with having those kinds of numbers. I mean, first of all, it's very unlikely that groups like that would be able to mobilize and get to the 5% threshold. And the other problem is, if they do that, there's a larger societal problem that we need to be dealing with.
Exactly.
Certainly. And I know, at least on a local level, we have anti-hate speech laws, and really that just means we need to get our politicians more educated on that, because if we have organizations popping up like that and are unchecked, that's more symptomatic of the system, not necessarily the people themselves. So I say, we have laws against that. Why aren't we acting on them?
That's definitely a fair assessment. I have a question for you then. In terms of protecting minorities and vulnerable sections of the population, what does PR do for these people compared to our current system?
I would say that it probably brings them more to the forefront and gets them help. For starters, with more stability in our government, we're going to have more stable funding going to the places that they need to go, and certainly within an electoral process, we see across the world that a proportional system brings out more women, more trans people, more non-binary folk, and so forth, certainly people of color, and that's going to strengthen our society internally as well. And I think as well we see, I mean, young people especially, right, which we're not actually a minority or even a fringe group anymore. We're the largest voting group next year, and I think since we're largely considered apathetic, I don't believe that for a second. I see we're frustrated and uninterested in participating in something that doesn't seem to work. We'll make it work, and we're going to be out there and participating. I think the same will follow with all the other groups as well. Certainly within the Green Party, we preach social justice, and giving us an extra leg up is going to see more opportunities to rectify the issues with our society around those groups.
Absolutely.
You were talking about stability, and now moving towards something that maybe the no side is, or people who may vote liberal or conservative would be worried about. You're a small business owner, you own a landscaping company. How do you think having PR and what you said with stability will affect small businesses in BC?
I mean, my business is extra small, so I don't usually get to see a whole much of red tape and so forth, but I can easily imagine that any organization that needs consistent funding for either fair wages or other things that you might get government assistance from, or even just consistent tax rates, we're going to see stability with that over a longer period of time. I really feel like when the conservative side comes out barking about stability, they're looking at it within like a 3 to 4 year time frame, which that's very narrow-sighted in my mind.
Yes.
We're looking at the big picture here. We're looking at not just the next 10, 15 years, but like 5, 6, 7 generations down the road. I think if businesses know that they can expect things to remain stable politically for a long term, we're going to see, especially with organizations coming from outside of the country, even Kinder Morgan, for example. If we had stable government, we might not be in the situation we're in now. But here we are.
There you go. But even for the short term, when you look at the kind of stability that people look for from government, not necessarily just with business, but if we look at the states, the way that power tends to flip-flop from the extremes to the extremes, with sides undoing the work of the previous government. We could look at DACA, all of the deportations that are going to be happening. All of these issues and all of this money that's being wasted based on flipping from extreme to extreme. Obviously, that's not very productive if you're trying to have any kind of business or be an entrepreneur in that environment.
Certainly not. Certainly not. We saw that with our conservative federal government. They were there for a decade and warming up the system for these fossil fuel companies to come in. We switched to a liberal government that arguably isn't that much more liberal than the Conservatives, at least with respect to pipelines, versus the provincial government here in BC. We were very conservative before, switched to a progressive government under the Conservative government. We said, yes, we're going to approve this pipeline. And as soon as the provincial government, as soon as the progressive government comes in, we say, no, we're going to just look at that again. And now we've created so much confusion. And we haven't even said, absolutely no, we can't do this, because we're not even sure if that's our jurisdiction. But we're not there. We can't even find out about that because we've got this switch in federal government, the switch in provincial government, and now we've got these municipal government elections that are coming up.
So far from the middle. There's no clear trajectory.
No. When you've got these majority governments, which one could argue are more successful at enacting policy within the short term, the only option really is to switch back and forth unless we can get a minority government, which is really not very common under first past the post.
And there tends to be a bit of a stigma about that, at least in Canadian politics, talking about minority governments, that they're unstable, that they tend to fall apart, that they don't get things done.
I would just argue that that person has not looked very hard at our history. We got public health care, or universal health care, under a minority government, one of the hallmark Canadian trademarks.
I'm not here to argue against you, but there does seem to be a sentiment floating around, especially when we talk to people just on the street. People, they tend to feel fearful that would lead to destabilization. But according to you, and I think from what we can see, that doesn't seem to be the case.
Well, we're a solid year into, it's not a coalition government per se, but certainly a minority-supported government, and I don't see anything happening to them anytime soon.
Right, now the ground is still here beneath our feet. We're still standing and breathing.
Absolute worst case, we have to go have another election, which, I mean, we certainly don't want to cause voter fatigue, but we only vote 3 times every 4 years. It's not that big of deal. It's not like down in America where you have the primaries,
your by-elections, the whole shebang. No, it's different.
And the thing is that where you go to the CBC and you get the promise tracker with all the promises that were kept and not. The latest, last week it showed, the Liberals and a majority government keeping 16% of the promises. And now if you go into the NDP, a minority government provincially, it showed them keeping 3/4 of the promises. And that is with a government that needs to seek approval for almost everything they do from the Greens. And on the other hand, they can do whatever they want, but they just chose that. And it shows you, you know, that having a party in the middle to hold people accountable is key to them staying on track.
Yeah, I think there is indeed a lot of fear about minority governments. I don't think it's based on a whole lot of really solid evidence. I mean, maybe in theory, the idea that you could be having an election every year or something, yeah, that sounds awful. But
it sounds awful. But is that the case?
I haven't seen that happening anywhere.
No.
Maybe not.
Fingers crossed, but we seem, I mean, certainly my experience within the BC Greens, we're far more dedicated to keeping government steady for the next 4 years just to prove that this thing can work. I mean, at the end of the day, especially with things like Site C or Kinder Morgan, I mean, if it doesn't work out with the NDP, it's not like it was going to work out any better with the BC Liberals. Yes. So I think it makes far more sense to hold on to that before just tossing up our hands and saying, let's have another election.
It keeps parties pragmatic. It keeps parties, you know, like realistic on what they can achieve in the long term. And you get people, leaders that are stable and that are effective, like in Europe, you know. It's less debt because they know they're pragmatic in what they can achieve. And it's not, you know, keeping promise, saying we're going to cut all the taxes, but we're not going to cut the services, and then you go into debt. Or we're going to increase all the services, but we're not going to increase our revenue, and then you go into debt. And that is what happens in Canada, and the United States, and the United Kingdom, where you have some of the highest levels of debt per capita, whereas you go to Nordic countries or Germany or New Zealand, and you see that they need to show some kind of financial proof for the parties in the middle to form coalitions with them. It really makes you be smarter politics.
Right, it's a coming together over base economic issues and having an understanding that regardless of which way you sway in the next election, you need to be set up. Yeah. And that, in the end, serves the people best.
Yes. I mean, preaching to the choir, but yes.
I know, I'm talking to you.
Yeah. Well, so thank you very much for coming. We had a great time with you, and hopefully we can continue being involved in the upcoming referendum.
Yeah, definitely. I'm really stoked to see two fellow young people engaged in politics, helping to get other people engaged more in politics, and it's a very exciting time for our province. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on the show, Ian. All right, that's it for us on this segment of Voting for Change. We'll see you next time.
Our guest this show was Mike Morris, a BC Liberal MLA from the Prince George area. His position against electoral reform and proportional representation concentrated on constitutional principles and legal arguments, concerning both the process itself around the referendum and the ballot questions. Now, in future shows, we'll talk more about both the values and the limitations and the advantages of the first-past-the-post system. But Mr. Morris clearly wanted to talk more about the legal and constitutional issues. Some of the points he raised were fairly technical and historical in nature, and I'm going to like to take a few minutes to just add some more context to some of his remarks. His basic claim is that proportional representation, indeed the referendum process itself, is unconstitutional. And by that he means it's inconsistent or in conflict with our basic laws and basic rules of our political system. One of the arguments that Mr. Morris made was that in the Constitution Act of 1867, which actually created Canada way back when, it states that Canada is to have a constitution similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom. And this is taken to mean that a parliamentary democracy in the UK, which is based on the plurality system, or first past the post, for representatives in each local riding. The implication is that PR, or proportional representation, therefore, is foreign or alien to the UK experience, and therefore unconstitutional if our constitution is to be similar to those in principle. Well, that might have been the case for a long time, but it's no longer the case in the UK as to what their constitution actually looks like. Their system has changed quite a lot over the last 30 to 40 years. In fact, through a process called devolution, or delegation, we've seen the creation of the Welsh Assembly in Wales, the Northern Ireland Assembly there, and a Scottish Parliament in Scotland. And in each of these three political systems and assemblies, there is a system of proportional representation that's been adapted to the first past the post system. In other words, there's the familiar system we have now in BC where there are local representatives elected by the first past the post or plurality process in each local district. And on top of that, in Scotland, Wales, and in Northern Ireland for their assemblies, there is also a proportional representation model that allows the election of other elected representatives on the basis of the proportion of votes cast to each political party contesting in that election. And there's a 5% threshold, which makes sure that any particularly small or fringe parties do not get any representation. Now, that's been going on for several elections in all three of these jurisdictions. So in other words, Canada's Constitution, if we were to adopt a form of PR here in BC, doesn't in any way violate the commitment in our original Constitution of keeping to a system that's similar to that of the United Kingdom. In fact, the United Kingdom has moved on and has embraced PR in a way much more fulsomely than we often take credit for. And in our system of constitutional government, a number of other principles besides democracy are at play. These include the supremacy of Parliament, the rule of law, and the division of powers that we have in our country between the provincial governments and the federal government in terms of a range of jurisdictions. So it's much more complicated than just appealing to one principle or another. Still, another argument is about the legality of the referendum process, which pivots on whether the current government here in BC had the right or authority to design a referendum process that was substantially different from the two previous referenda held in this province on this very question. Some of the critics will suggest that the current government was obliged under constitutional principles to have adopted a 60% threshold approval rate, as had been done in previous, that the government was obliged to have held a citizens' assembly to convene a group of British Columbians to consider options in a ballot question, and that the current government should have timed the referendum question around a general provincial election, not this fall after a municipal election. So, are those unconstitutional decisions by the current government? In my opinion, the short answer to each of those questions is no. There does not appear to be any binding requirement on the BC government to have followed past practices. Those were practices and decisions made by a government then. They're not firm, hard constitutional rules. They're at best practices. They're not even conventions because they haven't been around long enough. The BC government was well within its rights and its authority to design a referendum process as it saw fit within the existing legislation concerning this topic. It's acting within its jurisdiction as a provincial government well within its rights to amend the constitution of our own province, including our own voting system. There's no question about that. Now, if the referendum process results in a vote for reforming our electoral system, the system that would involve some changes to our provincial constitution. Mr. Morris pointed it out, and he's absolutely right. But we don't need to be afraid what that might mean. Let me just clarify what some of those could be if the referendum results in a vote for change. There would no doubt be required amendments to the Constitution Act of the province. That refers to language as to what does an electoral district actually mean. Would be changes to our Elections Act of how we conduct the way our voting takes place. And it would require some changes to our Electoral Districts Act, which concerns such matters as the number of legislative members or the number of seats, the names of those districts, and the size and boundaries of those ridings. Those are clearly questions that would be determined after a referendum. Finally, an issue raised by Mr. Morris concerns the right of voters to be reasonably informed about the issues and the choices surrounding the referendum and first past the post and the PR. And he's correct. This is no doubt a critical issue that we need to face together. So in our next show, we'll be talking with the Chief Electoral Officer of the province. We'll learn more about the role of Elections BC and what kind of information they'll be providing to assist you, the viewer, and other voters in the province to understand the referendum and become more reasonably informed around the values of voting and the choices that are being presented to you. Thank you very much.